The word Buddha means awake or the awakened one. And for many of us, the goal of Dharma practice is precisely this, to awaken from the sleep of ignorance, from the dream of delusion. And we actually have a glimpse of this possibility every time we wake up in the morning, as we awaken from deep sleep, or we come out of a dream state. We come into a waking consciousness which seems somehow more alive, more connected, more real. But the Buddha pointed out that even in our normal waking state, when we feel most awake and aware, we're still asleep. We're lost in and identified with all the various habit patterns of our minds. We see this very clearly even after the first day of a retreat. I'm sure you've noticed how often the mind hops on trains of association, gets lost in thought, memories, judgments, reactions, plans, desires, or simply a stream of random thoughts which carry us away again and again. Even in our normal waking state, what we call wakefulness, most of the time we're really not aware of what's going on. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a particular state mentioned that with a proper understanding very much lends itself to liberation, to the opening of the eye of wisdom. And this is the state called the bardo. You know, we're perhaps most familiar with it in the teachings of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you know, where there's a very detailed description of what happens in the time between one life and the next. And the point of those teachings is that in that state there are profound opportunities for liberation, for awakening. For most of us, though, the bardo between lifetimes is probably hypothetical, you know, unless we happen to have some direct memory of it. But the term bardo itself simply means intermediate state. It means a transition state. And in traveling a lot this summer, just before coming here, I had a really interesting bardo experience, which I thought I'd tell you about. I've been doing a lot of moving around, a lot of traveling. I was in Europe teaching, and I was on planes and trains and buses. And in one of the segments of this trip, with a lot of traveling, I landed in England, and I had to take a transfer bus from Gatwick Airport, where I landed outside of London, to Heathrow Airport. And so there was all the tumult of traveling and trying to catch the bus and make the connections. But on that bus, from Gatwick to Heathrow, they should put up a little plaque. In some way, my mind disengaged from time. You know, I had left where I had come from, and I hadn't yet arrived at where I was going. And it was either out of tiredness or just enjoying a time with nothing to do. My mind became very quiet, became very reflective, and quite unattached to being anywhere. You know, perhaps you've had that same feeling sometimes in flying. You know, you're not reading a book and you're not watching a movie and you're just looking out the window. You know, we enter into a kind of timeless space. In those moments, we drop out of the stories of our lives. We are no longer where we came from. We're not yet arrived at where we're going to. We simply are resting in awareness without attachment to any particular thing, to any particular state, even to any particular outcome. And it's in precisely these moments of timelessness, of not wanting, of not craving, when the empty, open, non-clinging nature of awareness reveals itself. That's the opportunity of the bardo, the intermediate state where the nature of awareness shows itself. At these times, it's as if the mind itself is inclining towards wisdom. And it often provokes a deeper than usual kind of investigation. And we begin to ask ourselves, what does keep us enmeshed in the stories of our lives? In the intermediate space between events. It's as if we step out of the continuum for a bit, and we can reflect, we can look, we can investigate, how do I stay so enmeshed in all the activities and stories of our lives, the dramas, desires? How do I get caught over and over again by the hands of time? Is it possible to be free? So the question for us is how to bring the great potential for awakening that often happens in these bardos of transition states. How do we bring that potential for awakening into the midst of our everyday busy lives? What can remind us again and again to truly wake up? In the Buddhist tradition, there are 4 reflections that have this power, that have the power to awaken us from delusion, to awaken from habitual actions and tendencies and responses, from the forward plunging momentum of samsaric seductiveness. This is something we're all familiar with. It's as if we're just caught in the momentum of the great seduction. These reflections, which will be familiar to you, there's nothing new. But it's important to hear them not as philosophic musings. It's not just Buddhist philosophy that we think about. They're really profound tools of practice that have the power in the midst of our daily lives to turn our minds towards the Dharma. And they are particularly powerful in the bardo of a retreat. This is really a bardo. You've left your life behind. You haven't yet picked it up. It's the intermediate state where there are so many possibilities for understanding. If we consider these 4 reflections during this time when our minds and hearts are so open, they really enter into our mind stream. They can influence our mind stream, sowing the seeds of remembrance throughout our lives when we are more engaged in activities. So the first of these reflections is a reflection on the preciousness of our human birth. How many times have you heard this? Probably for those of you who are experienced meditators, probably many times. But how often do we really reflect on it? How often do we really take the deep meaning of it? The Buddha had such a vast vision of the universe There's so many different realms of existence, higher ones and lower ones, countless world systems, immeasurable expanses of space and time. The Buddhist worldview is huge. Lives without beginning. And he taught how difficult and rare it is to have a human birth. In this vast scope of the universe, taking birth as a human is difficult, it's rare, it's precious. He said it's like arriving at a great treasure island where every possible happiness and the highest good is attainable, is achievable. I mean, it's an amazing opportunity when we reflect on it. It's just normally we're so caught up in our lives we don't stop to appreciate the possibilities that this precious human birth offers. As humans, as we know, there's just that right mix of happiness and suffering that reminds us to wake up. The heaven realms are a little too happy. The lower realms a little too much suffering. Here it's just right. Enough ease so that we actually can pay attention, and enough suffering to keep poking us to look. So when we have the great good fortune of having the time, the interest, the motivation for spiritual practice, for a spiritual investigation, can we see and appreciate these circumstances as a great gift? It's really a tremendous blessing in our lives, and not take them for granted or think that these conditions will always be there. It's a precious human birth. It's precious, it's rare. This reflection on the nature of the human realm and the opportunities for awakening that it provides can be the cause of a great joy and a great faith in our lives, even during times of suffering. Because as we know, this life is not a bliss trip. There's lots of ups and downs, and times when we're happy and times when we're not. So there's plenty of suffering that we go through in our lives. But in this precious human birth, even suffering can be a cause of joy and faith. Why? Well, the Buddha talked of two kinds of suffering. Suffering that leads simply to more suffering, when we're in a downward spiral. And he talked of suffering that leads to the end of suffering. Most of you probably know of our wonderful teacher, Deepa Ma, Bengali woman who died some years ago now, who had tremendous suffering in her life, tremendous grief. She was married at a very young age, as was common. She was married betrothed at 12, married at 14. Didn't have children for a long time, which was a source of great sadness, and then had 3 children, 2 of whom died soon after they were born. Her husband died. She was overwhelmed with grief. And she said, in recounting her story, she said she almost died from grief. She didn't leave her bed for 5 years. And this was overwhelming. She was living in Burma at the time. And somebody said, if you don't do something about your mind, you will surely die. And so she went to one of the meditation centers, and she just had this extraordinary, what in Buddhism is called parami, or background of her mind, and in a very short time attained high stages of realization, high stages of concentration, all the different psychic powers that you read about. I mean, an amazing manifestation. of accomplishment and attainment. And it was precisely the intensity of her suffering which so motivated her great realization. So that's the possibility for us. In this precious human birth, it's almost alchemical. We can transform suffering into enlightenment. So this is the first reflection that turns our mind towards the Dharma, the preciousness of our opportunities as a human being. The second reflection that turns our mind towards the Dharma, that helps awaken us right in the midst of our busy lives. Again, this is not about Buddhist philosophy. It's about what we do with our minds, how we see, how we perceive. So the second reflection is the contemplation of impermanence. Now, what's so striking about this is that we could go up to anybody on the streets of Woodacre, San Francisco, any place, and ask them, do things change? Everybody would say things change. It's not a secret. It's not an esoteric teaching. And yet, we know it, and everyone knows it, on an intellectual level, on a conceptual level. But somehow, we need to bring it down to the level of a living wisdom. It's not enough just, oh yes, everything changes. This reflection as one that turns the mind towards the Dharma requires something more. It requires a deep looking into and seeing directly, intimately, the truth of change. There was a student of Suzuki Roshi, who, as you know, was the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center. And this one student said, Roshi, I have been listening to your lectures for years, but I just don't understand. Could you please put the teachings in a nutshell? Can you reduce Buddhism to one phrase? So, as the story goes, everyone laughed, Suzuki Roshi laughed, and then he said, everything changes. Then he asked for another question. If we had to put Buddhism into one phrase, everything changes. Because if we could really see that and really know that deeply and intimately, the implication of that insight would be that we don't cling to anything. The most basic principle in Buddhism is that all things arise out of conditions. But things happen because the appropriate conditions for their arising are there, and that these conditions are always changing. Because so many times we've seen or know people who are living peaceful, stable, comfortable lives, and then in one moment something can happen, something can change, and everything is turned upside down. It might be a natural disaster. It might be an earthquake or a flood or a fire. It could be a random act of violence. It could be a war. It could be a disease. None of us are exempt from these changes. We think because our lives are stable and relatively comfortable at any particular time, we just assume that it will go on like that, because we have not contemplated deeply and clearly the great truth of change. We can experience this truth also in more ordinary ways, just in the ordinary experiences of our lives. And when we're paying close attention, when we're not distracted, we see that in every moment things are disappearing and new things are arising. It's not only each day or in each hour, but in every single moment. Something arises and passes, arises and passes. It's like water flowing over a waterfall. So if you can remember between now and the end of the talk, at the end of the talk, when you go out, when you begin walking, just watch carefully the flow of changing experiences, the flow of changing sights and sounds, and the touch of the air on your skin, and the sensations of movement as you walk, and the different thoughts that come and go, and the mood that you might be in. Just the very ordinary flow of events that are happening all the time when our attention is keen. And we're really paying attention carefully. This truth of change, of momentary change, becomes so obvious and so vivid. Notice what happens to each of these experiences as they arise. Do they last even more than a moment? The problem is that the truth of this is so ordinary that we mostly have stopped paying attention to it. It's not that it's hard to see, it's just the nature of everything that happens. But because it's so ordinary, we're not understanding it, we're not seeing it. And so we stay caught in our attachments, in our desires. When we don't pay attention to this truth of change, we really miss the opportunity to practice the mind of relinquishment, the mind of letting go. Ajahn Chah expressed this so well, the great Thai forest master. He said, if you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will have complete peace. Your struggles with the world will have come to an end. It's not complicated. It's not easy to do because of our habituated responses of mind, but it's not complicated. And so this is the second reflection that turns our mind towards the Dharma, right in the midst of our ordinary lives, our ordinary daily lives. We can train ourselves to pay attention to the changing nature of whatever's arising. Some careful observations of other obvious truths also has the power to jolt us out of perhaps our usual sense of complacency, out of our deeply rooted habit patterns of clinging. A simple and profound reflection, something we all know, but perhaps rarely give sustained attention to, is the fact that the end of birth is death. Our lives are only getting shorter and shorter. That's the direction it's going in. We seem to notice this more as we get older. It becomes more and more obvious, but it's equally true of all of us. The end of birth is death, inevitably. This is just what's happening. But until we're facing it directly for ourselves, often our awareness of death or our contemplation of death, it's often about other people. to other people who seem to be dying, and we don't make the connection. We need to turn that reflection back onto our own lives, our own experience. We don't often consider our own deaths. And in our culture in particular, it's considered a little morbid. Why would you want to think about your death? And yet from the Buddhist perspective, it's a reflection that liberates the heart and mind. The Buddha suggested thinking about it every single day. So just as an exercise, at some point, imagine yourselves on your deathbed. And since, for right now it is in our imagination, we can give ourselves a little comfort and let it be a nice, comfortable deathbed. Bed, soft pillow, nice mattress. But we're dying. So just imagine that. The senses are getting weak. There's probably discomfort or pain in the body. Maybe the mind is getting a little confused, not alert. Just imagine what it would be like. Okay, this dying process is happening. And right at that time, as you're imagining that, as you're visualizing that, what is it that we're most holding on to? What is it that we don't want to let go of? Can we practice simply allowing, letting be, whatever the process is? And of course, the trick of this is not to wait until we're dying to practice this. This is what we want to be practicing now in each moment. T.S. Eliot, in the Four Quartets, beautiful few lines when he really expressed this so succinctly, this possibility of openness, of relinquishment. And he wrote, "A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything, and all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well." Such beautiful expression. Can we connect with that mind, that heart of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything? Not holding on, allowing openness. And all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. So as we reflect on this truth of impermanence, and again as a reminder, it's not an intellectual reflection. This is a practice. As we actually practice seeing the impermanence in all of these different aspects of our lives, whether it's moment to moment, whether it's the big changing circumstances of our lives, whether it's the understanding that the end of birth is death, at whatever level we are connecting with this truth of impermanence, it's helpful to see what's our attitude about it. Do we let the truth of it, the magnitude of it, do we let it in? Does it inspire us? Does it frighten us? We really need to look to see the effect of this as we're doing this practice. One of the people who has most inspired me in this regard is Henry David Thoreau. And many of you probably know he died quite young. I think he was in his 40s. I believe it was of TB. Very sick, and a lot of pain in the body. And this is from a biography of Thoreau. Somebody was writing about him and the time of his death. They said, "Henry was never affected, never reached by his illness. Very often I've heard him tell his visitors that he enjoyed existence as well as ever. he remarked to me, this line is the line. This line is our practice. He remarked to me that there was as much comfort in perfect disease as in perfect health, the mind always conforming to the condition of the body. Now, that's remarkable. The mind just opening to, allowing, conforming to the condition of the body. There was as much comfort in perfect disease as in perfect health. It's quite a way of relating to experience. The thought of death, he said, could not begin to trouble him. None of his friends seemed to realize how very ill he was, so full of life and good cheer did he seem. One friend, as if by way of consolation,